going through our Storyboard series for about a month now. We started off hearing the story of Passover. We then went to Samson and Jonah, two guys who we've heard about for a long time. Aren't the best examples to follow, but there's a lot you could still learn from what not to do from their lives. And then last week, we basically talked about the example. We talked about Jesus the entire time, how everything we do needs to be on the foundation of him, that everything in church, it's great if you have an awesome building, it's great if you have different things going on in a church, but at the end of the day, if that foundation isn't Jesus, that other stuff really doesn't matter. And so this week, I can't really top that example from last week, but we're going to be talking about a guy named Joseph, and we're talking about the Old Testament Joseph, not Jesus' stepdad. We're talking about the Joseph that we see here in Genesis, and we're going to start off in chapter 37. So Joseph, he's mentioned before this point, but you really don't see that much about him. It basically just says he was born, and it talks about his brothers. He has a lot of brothers. And then in chapter 37, he's 17 years old at this point, and it tells us now Israel, so Israel and Jacob, that's the same person. So Israel's his dad, loved Joseph more than his other sons because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made a robe of many colors for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. So Joseph is his parents' favorite, and I personally really resonated with that. And my siblings might try to argue that, but I just said it in a sermon. I think that justifies it a little bit. But he's 17. He's his parents' favorite, and it's obvious. I mean, his dad gave him this awesome coat of many colors. And it just like rubs it in their face that much more. And they can't stand him. And it's when we find out that, then it says that Joseph had a dream. And in his dream, they had cut some grain, and their bundles of grain, all of his brothers' grain, bowed down to his. Now, knowing that Joseph's the youngest, he's got a lot of brothers, and they already don't like him. I personally probably wouldn't have shared that with them, but he did. And shocker, it didn't really help his relationship with them at all. Not only that, he has a second dream that even goes further than that. So it's similar. It has the stars bowing down to him, and then the sun and the moon, which represent his parents. And so what you see after that dream is dad has a talk with him, and it says his dad rebukes him for that one. Now he's brought the parents into it. He says, come on, son, you really think you're going to rule over us? And so it says he rebukes him, but at the end of that, it also says Jacob kept that matter in mind. He wasn't going to forget that. He thought maybe there is some truth to that, even though he rebuked him. And so it's that sets up a huge turning point in Joseph's life. So his brothers already hated him. Then he went and told them about these dreams where basically he's saying he's going to rule over them someday. So they're fired up. And so you get to verse 18 in chapter 37, and it says, they saw him in the distance, and before he had reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, oh, look, here comes the dream expert. So now, come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, Reuben's the oldest brother, he tried to save him from them. He said, let's not take his life. Reuben also said to them, don't shed blood. Throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, intending to rescue him from them and return him to his father. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's robe, the robe of many colors that he had on. Then they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty and without water. They sat down to eat a meal, and when they looked up, there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying aromatic gum, balsam, and resin going down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers agreed. When the Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who took Joseph to Egypt. You guys thought your siblings were harsh with you when you were younger. I mean, there's a whole lot in that little section that kind of caught my attention. One of those things being, I want want to back up Reuben here. So he stepped in and said, guys, come on, we can't kill him. Throw him in the pit. And he was planning on saving him later. And then it doesn't really say what was going on during the other part. Well, right after these verses, it says Reuben got back and had no idea they had sold him into slavery. So he didn't like cave in or anything. He was backing up Joseph. He just happened to like go somewhere for a little bit and then came back and saw he was already gone. I also think it's great that his brother Judah says, first off, he says, what do we gain if we kill our brother? I think that's really the root of it. But he ends that whole sentence with, let's sell him. I mean, he is our brother. Like, that's so much better than just killing him, like, we're going to sell him into slavery. At least it's not killing him. And so his brothers sell him into slavery. He ends up in Egypt, and he's sold to a man named Potiphar. And one thing Potiphar notices really fast is everything Joseph does flourishes. It doesn't, it's blessed. It's very obviously everything goes extremely well when Joseph's the one in charge. And so knowing that, he puts Joseph in charge of everything that he has. Because why not? Everything the guy does is doing incredible. And so things are going pretty well for Joseph. I mean, he's still a slave or a servant, but he's like the head slave or servant. And then Genesis 39 happens. And in verses 6 and 7, it tells us that Joseph was well-built and handsome. It's not a bad thing for Scripture to say about you. But Potiphar's wife took notice of him. And she saw him and said, come lie down with me. Now, if this was about Samson, as we heard a few weeks ago, this probably would have had a different outcome because he gave in to lust like every chance he had. But Joseph actually says no. He says, I couldn't do that against your master, or my master, your husband, and I couldn't do that against God. So he does the right thing. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. But she didn't exactly like that answer. So she keeps being persistent until finally there's a day where it's just the two of them at the house. And so she again says, come lie down with me. And this time she grabs him by the coat. His coats only get him into trouble. His first coat rubbed it into his siblings. This one, she grabs and he just takes off. So we talked about fleeing from lust. That's like the best way to do it. Just take off, get out of the room. But he like squirmed and left his coat in her hand. And so she took that and went to the other servants and said, look, he tried to force himself on me and left his coat in the process. And then she told her husband the same thing. And so even though Joseph did exactly what he was supposed to do, he didn't give in to that temptation, he's thrown into jail. Now, it's kind of interesting. They don't know why he was thrown into jail. That crime would normally have been death for what he did. So they think, they honestly don't know. They think maybe Potiphar's wife stuck up for him because she was hoping she'd somehow be able to still sleep with him. That seems a little bit far-fetched. The other one is maybe Potiphar knew how his wife was and so still wanted to punish him, but knew his wife probably had something to do with it. But either way, what we see from this is hardship happens even when we're obedient. Even when we do the right thing, we have faith in God and we trust Him in things, that doesn't mean things are going to always be a cakewalk. And I think there's a lot of examples we can pull from our own lives where that's true. But I mean, think about it. If hardship didn't happen when we're obedient, we wouldn't be hearing about these martyrs in other parts of the world. There'd be a lot more people coming to church. If your hardships disappeared, if you were obedient, there'd be a lot more faithful Christians. That's just not what we see. In Joseph's life, you could even point to the first thing that happened. Yeah, it looks like he might have been a little arrogant when he talked about those dreams with his brothers and his parents. I don't know if that is really justified as that means he should have been sold into slavery. That seems a little bit extreme. My brother's done a lot of, he's probably said a lot of arrogant things to me. I've never sold him into slavery. So I don't think that's a good reason. He had two things happen where, man, he didn't necessarily do the wrong thing, but hardship happened anyways. We need to be prepared for that. We have a God that's always with us through those things. And I think it's pretty clear in Joseph's life, as we're going to continue on in just a minute, God was definitely with him. But we need to be clear, it's not like life becomes easy. It's not like it promises us in the Bible, if you give faithfully to the church, God will make you a millionaire. I wish that was true, because again, that would probably benefit the church a lot. But that's not what we see in Scripture. And so at this point, this is probably one of the lower points for Joseph. I mean, he was sold into slavery. That's a pretty low point too. But now he's in jail. But the guard in charge of the jail notices something about him. The same thing Potiphar did. Every time Joseph's given any kind of responsibility, it just is blessed. Like it's done in an incredible way, and it flourishes. And so the guard puts him in charge of the other prisoners. And then what you see is there's these men who start talking about these dreams they had. They can't figure them out. And Joseph, this time, first off, gives God the credit for being able to interpret the dreams. But on top of that, he tells them what their dreams mean. Now, these guys don't know what to think of Joseph. They're probably confused why this prisoner would know how to interpret dreams in the first place. But what he tells them those dreams meant comes true, which means one of those guys actually died. And so the one who is still alive realized this guy knows what he's talking about. And so when the Pharaoh talked about having a dream that no one could interpret, this guy says, well, actually, I know someone who might be able to tell you what that dream means. And so they bring Joseph to the Pharaoh. They had to clean him up. He was in jail. He probably wasn't the cleanest there. So it says that they cleaned him up, got him shaved, then took him to the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh says, well, so I hear you know how to interpret dreams. And Joseph says, it's not me that's doing the interpreting, it's God. I'm just telling you what he says it means. And so Pharaoh lays out his entire dream, and Joseph tells him what that dream means is that there's going to be 7 years of a surplus of crops. They're going to have an abundance of the different plants they need, the different things they need as a nation. But then that's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And so what they need to do is put a wise person in charge to build storehouses to then store up that surplus of food so that when the famine comes, they're not going to be in trouble. So it says the Pharaoh heard that, and he was pleased with it. And he said, well, I can't think of anyone wiser than the one guy who could actually tell me what that dream even meant. And so he puts Joseph as second in command of all of Egypt. The only person above Joseph is the Pharaoh himself. Talk about a rise to fame. He went from being a prisoner to second in command in a matter of minutes. And shocker, exactly what he said in those dreams came true. They had a surplus of things, and then the famine hit. And it actually says, by the way, Joseph was 17 when this all started. When he came to power, he was 30. So it's only been 13 years since some of the earlier things happened. So when that famine hits, not too long into that famine, guess who comes rolling into Egypt? In Genesis chapter 42, verse 5, it says, the sons of Israel, so the sons of Jacob, were among those who came to buy grain, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Joseph was in charge of the country. He sold grain to all its people. his brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan, to buy food," they replied. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. I can only imagine what was going through Joseph's mind in that moment. He sees his brothers, the same guys that sold him into slavery, walk in needing something that he's in charge of. He was probably angry. He was probably hurt. And he doesn't tell them who he is right away. It says he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. And we're not going to read it, but he kind of gives them the runaround when it comes to getting grain consistently. He'll give them grain, but then he goes through this thing. He calls them spies. He sets it up where it looks like one of them stole from him, and so he arrests that guy. And basically the brothers are like, "God, what are you doing to us? What did we do to deserve this?" They probably should have been able to figure that out. But he tests them in different ways until finally he can't. And we see that in Genesis chapter 45. It says, Joseph could no longer keep his composure in front of all his attendants. So he called out, "Send everyone away from me." No one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and also Pharaoh's household heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. They probably should be. I mean, he's the guy that's in charge of giving them grain. He arrested some of them already. They know this guy's got power. And then they realize, we sold this guy into slavery. They have every reason to be afraid. And then I love Joseph's response. He says to his brothers, "Please come near me." And they came near. "I am Joseph, your brother," he said, "the one you sold into Egypt," because they forgot about that. "Now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here." I don't think that's the emotions they exactly felt in that moment either. I think they were more afraid for their lives than feeling bad about what they did. He says, "Don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all of the land of Egypt." I don't know if I'd respond the same way. Guys, we need to forgive just like Joseph forgave. Now, I also want to point out, he didn't do that right away. He had them going for a little bit. He spoke harshly to them. He treated them like strangers. We don't know exactly how long that period of time was, but he made them go back and forth from Canaan to Egypt a couple times. He accused them of stealing, he had a harsh way of dealing with them, so I'd say he probably didn't forgive them right away. It was a little bit of a process. And I think that's more than true for us today, too. There are people that they just hurt us, and we may not even do something, especially in our minds, to deserve that. Yet we're supposed to forgive. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that's an easy thing to do, because it's not. It's incredibly hard, especially depending on what people have done to you. It's absolutely hard to actually come to a place of forgiveness. And that doesn't mean you forgive them and then let them just keep hurting you in the exact same way. I don't want to make it seem like we have to be some kind of weak. You still protect yourself from being hurt like that again. But when you don't forgive someone, it only brings you down. That grudge eats away at you. And there's plenty of insane examples of people forgiving, but at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily make it any easier for us to have to do that. I think Joseph had a lot of reasons to be really mad at his brothers and not forgive them. But he still forgave. I think this really feeds into the last point that I really wanted to focus on in this story. That's that God can use seemingly bad situations for good. The way Joseph got to Egypt was he was sold into slavery by his brothers. I don't think they meant that for any kind of positive outcome besides the money they got. And look how God used it. And that Joseph even said, right in what I just read a little bit ago, he says, therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. He's saying it was God who put him in Egypt. And so what you see that this is how the Israelites end up coming to Egypt. So they move there because they don't have any food in their land. So eventually, once he tells his brothers who he is, they all move to Egypt to be with him. It's how the Israelites ended up being there in the time of Moses. That was a lot later, but that's how they got to Egypt in the first place, was because of Joseph being there and taking care of his family. But what we see happen is in chapter 50, Joseph's dad, Jacob, passes away. And at that point, his brothers think, now that dad's not here to protect us, we're in trouble. They keep going back to the fact they don't get how Joseph could really forgive. They think he's got to be holding some kind of grudge. And so in chapter 50, verse 19, it says, but Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me, but God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. He's recognizing that even though they meant for that to be something bad, God turned that around and used it for good. And there's a lot of examples of that in the Bible. There's also a lot of examples of that sitting in this room. Anyone who has put their faith in Jesus Christ has some kind of story like that, even if they grew up in church. Where you're heading without Jesus is not where you want to go. And God turns bad situations, he turns just broken things into beautiful things all the time. With that in mind, it's important to say we're not always going to see the good at the end of that. We can read the end of this book and see it ends up being good. But some of us would rather see that in our lifetime than have to just plan on it ahead of time. We'd like to see how could God possibly use this hard situation he's put me in for anything good while I'm here. And I can't really answer that. There's going to be times it is hard. And I can tell you, you're going to be able to walk with people who go through the same thing and help them through it, but that really doesn't help you get through it in the meantime. So all I can really say is, again, that God's with you through that there will be a day where there is no sorrow anymore, and that God can turn bad situations and broken things into something beautiful. And there's the perfect example of that is exactly why we do communion on a regular basis. The best example of something bad being turned for good is what happened on the cross. There's a lot of bad that led up to that event. There's a lot of good too. Jesus did incredible things, yet even though he didn't deserve it, Judas betrayed him for money, and he died one of the most gruesome ways in the history of mankind. The cross is brutal and disturbing when you think about exactly what happened on there, yet we hang them all over churches and wear them as jewelry as a symbol of hope. Only God can do something like that. And so as we get ready to take communion in a little bit, That's the whole reason we come to celebrate, that we can have hope because of what he's already done. We can't do anything in our lives to get that forgiveness that we need. We've messed up and we can't pay the debt. We've messed up that bad where we can't even pay that debt. And so as believers, we come and take communion as a church family to help reflect on that. First off, it does tell us to do that in Scripture too. It tells us to take communion. It's not like we just made this up. But it's important for us to always come back to that. Last week, John Jackson talked about how our foundation needs to be Christ. This should be a monthly reminder. We do it monthly. There's places that do it every week, and as long as we don't ever take it for granted what it represents, we can do it as often as we want. It's not like there's a rule in here that says you can do it too much. But as we take the bread, as we drink the grape juice, hopefully we think about what those represent. The fact that Jesus Christ paid that price for us.